Hello, my name is Laura Hartman, and I am presenting some research that I've done about the Marshall Islands. It's called Going Nowhere in the Marshall Islands, Resistance to Displacement as Climate Activism. And this is a conference that's a teaching conference about climate change, and so I wanted to present to you a version of a unit that I do with my students in a class about the Marshall Islands and climate change. This allows us to talk about climate justice and the environmental humanities. So to situate myself a little bit, I am not an expert in any of these topics, and I've never been to the Marshall Islands. I was drawn to this topic simply due to Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner's poetry and to the effects that I saw that poetry have on my students. In particular, her poem Tell Them, which I'll be discussing later, caused me to think about the importance of the voices of those who are affected on the front lines of climate change, and it seemed to give license to readers and scholars to act as megaphones to amplify those voices. So I did some further reading on the situation, and I came up with what I'm about to present to you today. But again, I'm not an expert, so I welcome input, critiques, suggestions. I hope that what follows will respect and lift up the voices of those living in the Marshall Islands and others on the front line of the climate crisis. So to start with some background concepts, when I discuss this in classes, for many weeks we have been establishing some of these philosophical concepts. One is justice. So if we're talking about climate justice, we need to be able to understand what justice is. Justice gets defined in three ways: as fairness, balance, and righteousness. We also look at different types of justice, like distributive justice. That's a question of who gets what and is it fair. We look at the benefits and the harms in the situation and see how they are distributed. Procedural justice asks how we make decisions. Are they made in a way that is just, and whose voices are heard in that process? And then finally, retributive justice is about how we make things right after a wrong has happened. Is there compensation? Is there amends that need to be made? How do we bring back that balance after an injustice has disrupted the balance? We also use the concept of displacement in place. This comes from Rob Nixon, or at least I use the version that Rob Nixon uses in his Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where he is talking about the loss of land and resources beneath a people, which leaves communities stranded in a place that is stripped of the very characteristics that made it inhabitable. Such a threat entails being simultaneously immobilized and moved out of one's living knowledge, as one's place loses its life-sustaining features. And we have, the people in the Marshall Islands have experienced this. We will see that. But also, when it comes to place-related concepts, we're looking at the emplacement framework. This is a new set of ideas from a paper that I've been working on with a colleague about emplacement. So we're creating this framework of ideas that tries to describe place not as something static, but as something dynamic. People, organisms, other physical and cultural elements of a place can get displaced, which is they are removed from their place. They can get misplaced, whether there's a misguided installation in place. They can get replaced, where something is restored after displacement or misplacement. And they can get emplaced, which we're describing as, it's like replacement, but it's more creative, it's more collaborative, it brings it to another level. Without this idea of emplacement, which is more dynamic, these others become simply xenophobic. Emplacement is where elements, people, cultural things, organisms really find a way to belong in their place in a dynamic and empowered kind of way. And as we keep discussing, you will see this concept come up. Okay, so a little bit of background about the Marshall Islands. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean. As you can see on the map there, it's between Hawaii and Papua New Guinea. The inset map shows you that it is a collection of many, many islands and atolls, some of which are inhabited and some of which aren't. Now, the ancestors of those who are native to the Marshall Islands arrived probably about the year 2000 BCE. Much later colonists from Germany, Japan, Spain, and the United States have brought outside influences. They've brought cars, they brought Christianity, they've brought rice, they brought air conditioners. All of these influences have come to these islands, and the dynamism of such influences has resulted in both displacement, that is to say, traditional practices or traditional organisms being uprooted, and misplacement, that would be the infiltration of something that doesn't quite fit in the place. Now, these colonial forces also raise questions of justice. Distributive justice. Are the colonists simply extracting resources or other advantages from the Marshall Islands? Well, yes, primarily. They're often using them as a naval base. Are there disadvantages for the locals? Yes, they tend to be uncompensated and their culture begins to erode. Also, procedural justice. Did this happen with the consent of the Marshallese? No. Now, after World War II, the United Nations granted oversight of the Marshall Islands to the United States as a trust territory. This included a responsibility to protect the health of the inhabitants and to protect the inhabitants against the loss of their land or resources. Ironically, this double charge turned out to be self-contradictory because of the way that the United States wanted to use these islands. The United States conducted 67 nuclear tests on parts of the Marshall Islands in the 1940s and 1950s, with devastating effects on human and ecosystem health. Marshallese were not fully informed about the effects of the tests, and they also did not consent to them, clear violations of procedural justice. Officials told residents that their sacrifices had been made, quote, for the good of mankind. This is to say that humanity as a whole benefits, while the residents endure harms, and this is a clear violation of distributive justice as well. All of the residents of the Marshall Islands experienced health and ecological effects from the nuclear fallout, but the nuclear testing literally led to the displacement of residents of the Bikini Atoll. They were moved off of their land to make way for the weapons testing. Bikinians residing in the other parts of the Marshall Islands report feeling misplaced, homesick for Bikini, and unable to return. Now, U.S. government testing has shown that Bikini's radiation levels may be safe for occupancy, but they're not safe for eating locally produced food or drinking local water. Returning, though it would satisfy the depth of cultural homesickness endured by generations of Bikinians, would still be misplacement, not replacement, because it is a return to a maladapted landscape, rather than a return to its prior form. The Republic of the Marshall Islands gained independence in 1986. The Marshall Islands also has a compact of free association with the United States, which states that Marshallese may come to the U.S. to work, although they cannot become citizens. Additionally, the Marshall Islands receive significant foreign aid and investment from the United States, about $70 million annually. Also, oh, sorry, that was me repeating myself. My question is this an attempt at retributive justice? That would be, is this a compensation for their nuclear-related sacrifices? Probably it is. One wonders whether it's enough. All right, so climate change in particular. In the Marshallese language, the word used for climate is mechatoto, which implies more than simply meteorological conditions. Mechatoto means weather patterns and such, but it also can include cultural and social factors, as well as aspects of nature such as solar eclipses and diseases. Thus, while Marshallese recognize that the sea levels are rising and weather patterns are becoming more extreme, they also diagnose cultural decline and Americanization as evidence of climate change. Their potential displacement due to sea level rise can be blamed on the misplacement of pernicious outside influences. Now, according to Rudyat Gould, who is an anthropologist who's done work in the Marshall Islands, the Marshallese are quick to assume personal responsibility for climate change. They don't take on a posture of what he calls industrial blame. So that's in the left-hand column here. Industrial blame would point the finger at bigger countries. It would say climate change is caused by the bigger, richer countries that emit too much carbon dioxide. And so when it comes to the Marshall Islands, these bigger countries need to listen to the smaller voices of the Marshallese. Instead, the people who Rudyat Gould spoke with preferred universal blame. so that's in the right-hand column, universal blame says that climate change is caused by, quote, everyone. And so when it comes to the Marshall Islands, they look for local causes of climate change, which include cultural decline and Americanization. Now, to us, this might look like needless self-flagellation. But according to Rudyat Gould, Marshallese activists see an opportunity to turn climate change into the final proof of modernity's folly, a powerful inspiration to revitalize older ways. This strongly echoes Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh's assessment of climate change as proof that, quote, the patterns of life that modernity engenders can only be practiced by a small minority of the world's population, end quote. So if modernity is a false promise, then the Marshallese impulse to return to traditional ways and to re-entrench in their place and their culture is a wise response to the climate crisis. And yet, clearly, the rising seas cannot be stopped by the actions of a handful of people on a tiny island. More powerful global actors also need to take action. Thus, some Marshallese voices do endorse that first narrative of industrial blame. Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner is one of these voices. She became well known after reciting her poem, Dear Matafele Penam, at the United Nations Climate Summit in New York City in 2014. I have listed here a link to an excellent video rendition of her poem. My students just love it. If you haven't seen it, I recommend taking a pause to go watch it. The poem is addressed to her infant daughter with worries about her future, but it is clearly also intended for those who have the power to stop the rising seas from swallowing up her island home. She is calling for climate justice in the sense of procedural justice. She says, there are those hidden behind platinum titles who like to pretend that we don't exist. So she's calling for her voice to be heard. But also distributive justice. She writes, they're marching for you, baby. They're marching for us because we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. So that's about the distribution of safety and well-being, distributive justice. Jetnil-Kijiner has several poems about climate change. I also highly recommend a poem she jointly wrote with Greenland's indigenous poet Activism called Rise. Again, there's a link to the video. You should follow that link and prepare for some devastating, amazing poetry. In the poem, she and Niviana make clear that their ability to live in their native lands depends on others' willingness to act on climate change. Jetnil-Kijiner's tone is biting. She writes, you think you have decades before your home falls beneath tides? We have years. We have months before you sacrifice us again, before you watch from your TV screens, computer screens, to see if we will still be breathing while you do nothing. Now this is the industrial narrative of blame with a vengeance. I am particularly struck by Jetnil-Kijiner's description of the ocean flooding across our cemeteries and crashing against our homes, because this is no exaggeration. In Rise, both poets refer to their islands as the home of ancestors, hearkening to ancient graveyards disturbed by climate change. Multiple graveyards in the Marshall Islands, graveyards which have been firmly in place for centuries, are subject to significant erosion for the first time due to rising sea levels. The gravestones will shift, sag, and tumble into the surf. And it isn't just in the Marshall Islands. In the polar regions where Akaniviana lives, graveyards are also being disturbed by melting permafrost. The graveyard image was used to good effect in another source, which I want to endorse, and this source embraces the narrative of industrial blame for climate change. This is a Marshallese film called Jalel, The Calling of the Shell. And this film is available for purchase and download. I have found my students really enjoy watching clips of it in class. This global warming fairy tale tells of a magical shell that shuts off electronics, cars, and other energy-using devices. The main character, Molina, receives the shell from her grandmother, who then dies and is buried in a graveyard that is threatened by rising seas. The film emphasizes the importance of ancestors and their graves. As rising seas threaten the graves of the ancestors, it brings to mind Rob Nixon's statement that climate change is a threat across generations, to the living, the unborn, and the animate deceased. That is to say, it's not just future generations, it's also past generations who are threatened by climate change. In the film, Melina is inspired to rescue her grandmother's grave, so she sends the shell to the White House in Washington, D.C. Due to the shell's magical effects, the lights go off in the White House. The lights go off in the Capitol. The lights go off throughout the nation, and suddenly fossil fuel use all over the nation and all over the world ceases. This film, like Jetnil-Kijiner's poems, appears to be geared toward decision makers who have the power to truly affect climate change. The film, in fact, ends with Jetnil-Kijiner reciting her poem, Tell Them, which I'll discuss in a moment. So, people in the Marshall Islands are facing the need to leave. But many of them are leaving. So, I'm about to tell you about how most of them don't want to leave, but some people in the Marshall Islands have left. The Compact of Free Association with the United States means that they can freely come to the USA and work, although they cannot become citizens. More than a quarter of the Marshallese population lives in the United States, concentrated in Hawaii, California, and Springdale, Arkansas, where they tend to work for Tyson Foods, or this guy works for Walmart. However, these people are not leaving the Marshall Islands because of the climate crisis in particular. They tend to leave for education or economic purposes, just like any other migrants. When it comes to climate change, many of the other coral atoll nations are investigating evacuation options. Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Maldives have all looked into the possibility of purchasing another homeland or applying for asylum in another country, such as Australia or New Zealand. Whether the climate displaced would also bring relics from their graveyards with them remains to be seen. But suffice it to say, the break with traditional landscapes is potentially devastating on a cultural level. However, it may be necessary. Now, the government of the Marshall Islands, by contrast, steadfastly advocates against any kind of evacuation option. In the words of the Republic of Marshall Islands Permanent Mission to the United Nations, quote, "The reclassification of Marshallese as a displaced nation or climate refugees is not only undesirable, but also unacceptable as an affront to self-determination and national dignity," end quote. The Marshallese government firmly refused to consider relocation for many years, and even language of adaptation to risen seas was issued in favor of mitigation discourse. Now, however, leaders are considering ways to build the islands higher as a way to weather the rising tides. And that picture there shows the building of a seawall. But they're also talking about dredging the lagoons to get material from the bottom of the ocean and building up higher elevation areas on the islands so people are safe from the seas. Jetnil-Kijiner founded a grassroots organization for youth empowerment in the Marshall Islands called Jojikum, which means your place. Its slogan, Rooted Deeply, encourages Marshallese youth to root themselves in their land, like a tree, immovable. The executive director of the Marshall Islands Conservation Society agrees. Quote, "We're not going, we're going to stay here until it's unlivable," end quote. According to Rudyat Gould, the anthropologist, the citizens view relocation as such a horrific solution that the country must not resign itself to it, at least not yet. Rudyat Gould describes multiple interviews in which Marshallese declared themselves with some bravado ready to drown rather than abandon their islands, even as the seas rise around them. Sometimes this takes the form of joking, as Marshallese culture includes robust gallows humor. Rudyat Gould quotes the following humorous responses to rising sea levels. "We'll float. Ujjayi won't be very good for living, but it will be great for spearfishing. The Capitol building will make a great dive site." Sometimes it comes out as a knowingly ludicrous suggestion for solving the problem. "We'll swim. We'll just climb up the breadfruit trees. We'll live in the water catchments. Donate life preservers, our kids and grandkids will need them. A ship will bring a mountain from America. Why don't you Americans give us the Rocky Mountains to live on? We can go live in California. Obama will give us half the state to live in. Has anybody claimed Antarctica? Whether through gallows humor or through practical measures to build the islands higher, Marshall Islanders are changing a narrative of victimization, one that echoes their colonial and nuclear past, into a narrative of self-authorship and relative autonomy. Their choice not to leave is a choice not to suffer displacement in place. Bikini Islanders had to evacuate their atoll at the time of the nuclear tests, and were moved multiple times to islands with fewer resources, which led to starvation, and to islands with different geographies, which necessitated cultural change as well. It was a really hard thing for the Bikini Islanders to do this. As discussed above, this subjected them to displacement and misplacement, with little hope for replacement to their original lands. The Marshall Islands as a whole has seen entire islands disappear with the nuclear tests. They know their own islands could disappear with climate change. But they've also seen what happens when communities must abandon their islands, particularly when they do so at the urging of a foreign government that does not understand their needs or culture. Marshall Islanders know the threat of climate change is real, but they're choosing neither displacement nor misplacement. They're choosing their own type of emplacement, which involves renewing cultural ties, revitalizing local agriculture, which is the picture on the right there, and investing in technologies of self-sufficiency such as solar panels, which is the picture on the left there. That's actually a complex where there's a bunch of solar panels and water collection catchments for fresh water. As the seas rise, fresh water availability becomes more and more of an issue in these islands. The choice not to leave is also a kind of protest aimed at those with greater global power. In Jetnil-Kijiner's poem, Tell Them, she is sending handcrafted earrings and baskets as envoys to the United States, items that synthesize the island's natural resources and its human culture. Them is people in the United States. Jetnil-Kijiner writes, "But most importantly, you tell them we don't want to leave. We've never wanted to leave, and that we are nothing without our islands." Jetnil-Kijiner's interest in keeping her homeland safe from climate change rather than moving away is consistent throughout her poems. In Rise, she tells an ancestral story about two sisters separated who turned to stone through commitment and longing. Jetnil-Kijiner writes in the poem, "Despite what we are told, we will not leave. We will choose stone. We will choose to be rooted to this reef forever." In that rootedness, Jetnil-Kijiner commits to a particularly Marshallese version of emplacement, shaped by environment and culture. But she also sets up a particularly dramatic form of climate protest, a protracted sit-in, so to speak. The Marshall Islands are small and weak, but these qualities can be parlayed into strength in a context of climate protest. The United States in 1960 was moved by images of African American students sitting at a segregated lunch counter and brutalized by the police. The bad guys in the scenario became not the black youth, which is what that racist society would have expected, but rather the bad guys were the police. Ironically, by calling media attention to their experience as racial victims, the African Americans became empowered. And this power brought self-examination and finally reform to their oppressors' racist practices. Their weakness became a strength. The Marshallese conviction not to succumb to displacement is complex. It is perhaps primarily a movement of self-determination and empowerment after years and years of colonialism. But to the degree that it is also a political statement, it resembles those African American students at the lunch counter. It is strength through weakness. Jetnil-Kijiner emphasizes her young, innocent child in her poems. Jalel calls on the old and the young. There is vulnerability here, but persuasive power as well. The Marshallese are calling attention to their experience as victims of the climate crisis while also being empowered to determine their own future. I love that slogan on this banner that they're holding in this protest. Marshall Islands, we are not drowning, we are fighting. Justice is called for here. What is fair? What is balanced? What is righteous? Attention to those who are vulnerable to climate crisis, yet innocent of its cause, raises questions of distributive justice. The burdens are borne by those who don't really get the benefits. It also raises questions of retribution. Should they somehow be compensated? The prerequisite for both types of justice may be procedural justice, which calls for the voices of those affected to be heard. The people of the Marshall Islands want to be noticed, listened to, and taken into account. To that end, I give the last words to Jetnil-Kijiner, who wants us to remember that beyond the discussions, numbers, and statistics, there are faces. All the way out here, there is a toddler stomping squeaky yellow light-up shoes across the edge of a reef not yet underwater. And there are my sources so that you can go look these things up yourself and learn more. Thanks for your attention. I hope that this presentation was of some benefit.